So like I said, we've got a wide array of perspectives here. Wesley comes from Felicis, which is a global VC, invests in companies all over the world. Chris is an EIR at DCVC, but really is doing more on the investment side. Was a co-founder of Planet Labs and the CTO, or still is a co-founder, space mission architect at NASA Ames Research Center. So really a focus on the hard data-driven companies and science and engineering companies. And then Michael Sharkey is the CEO of Autopilot, hails from Australia, but has been in Silicon Valley for the past few years, running his company, and has received money from both sides, here in Australia as well as in Silicon Valley. So lots of perspectives. I want to start with you, Michael. You did move your company 6 years ago and HQ'd it in Silicon Valley after picking up some seed money here. What did you learn there? What was most surprising to you? And would you do that today if you started your company today?
Yeah, so if you rewind 5 years ago in Australia, as many of you would know, there was not a lot going on here. I mean, I didn't even know what the word startup was back then until I sort of arrived in Silicon Valley, so I was a bit out of the loop. But we were fortunate of one of the sort of two firms that existed here to pick up some seed money. They were able to introduce us and help us form relationships in the US, and then we sort of, worked our way and met people, and kind of the business progressed from there. I think though it's changed in the last 5 years, right? You've got, Bill mentioned earlier on stage, StartMate formed here, and then they founded Blackbird, which really helped the ecosystem. Now you've got Airtree and various other funds that were mentioned on stage. And so there is funding here now. There's an ecosystem. It's very new, but it's forming. And so, maybe these days, if we were starting again, we would be able to raise significant funds here and stay here, quite frankly.
Wesley, I want to ask you, like, when you look at the Australian market, you've invested in a couple big companies here. What is it that you're looking for, and what do you think is missing from this market when people pitch you?
Yeah, we're lucky enough to be lead investors in both Canva and in CultureAmp. CultureAmp's based in Melbourne, and Canva's here in Sydney. And it just sort of shows that you can have amazing companies anywhere in the world, especially here. I mean, Mike's company is great too, and he's in Silicon Valley, but you started here in Australia. And the big sort of difference with Canva and CultureAmp is that the teams are located here, they're based here, they're recruiting and hiring people here, and I think that was always a concern of investors in Silicon Valley, where if you're building a company in Australia, the best talent's in San Francisco, or you're gonna have to hire the people out there, or like there's no product management here in Sydney, and that's these companies have shown that that's not the case anymore. And Canva's probably one of the fastest growing companies in our portfolio. So we never set out to find companies in a specific geography. We're not here to go and find Australian companies. We happen to find great companies that are like killing it and doing so well in their field. And these two happen to be in Australia. And I think we were fortunate enough to sort of be investors in it. It just shows that you can have really amazing companies that are top of class in the business that they're in, and have them be located anywhere in the world.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but both of those companies have global ambition.
They do. When we invest in companies that are not located in driving distance of us, we sort of have two requirements, and this is maybe not obvious for a lot of other firms. The first is that they have to have global ambitions. I've seen a lot of companies having sort of been in Australia. I'm here almost every 4 months or so for board meetings, and also to catch up with the founding team and the product teams at these different companies. And the first is that a lot of companies in Australia are like, oh, we're only targeting Australia, and that's a hard one, right? It's great to be in one market, but the non-obvious insight that CultureAmp and Canva had was, they were already in multiple countries and multiple languages, and sort of growing quickly because of that. The second thing that we sort of look for is the ability to have complete teams. One of the things that I cannot do from San Francisco, so far away, is to sort of recruit, senior executives in Australia for an Australian company. That's something that is not within my capability. So we do sometimes work with local partners like Blackbird and Airtree to sort of solve for some of that, but we like to see companies already with full teams, because that allows you to execute, and also it's something that is not things that we're able to solve for the companies that are located here. And both CultureAmp and Canva had that already solved when we met them.
Chris, to you, we talked about this a little bit backstage. What to you is the most important advantage that a company has launching and staying here in Australia versus Silicon Valley and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we, typically in the US and Canada, we want companies to relocate to the Bay Area because all of the talent has, just as, you mentioned. So
don't forget New York, though.
Yeah, but even
that's where I'm from.
So if you're doing a finance startup, I think New York's a fantastic place to be, and we'd probably push you out of the Valley and push you back to New York. But if you were doing something else, where you needed a particular kind of technical expertise, that talent is probably in the Bay Area. So in Australia, that's not the case. Everyone's here and they're available, and I think there tends to be a lot of loyalty. A lot of people are excited to work for startups, and so I think the market here, talent's more accessible, and we don't need to demand that they move so that we know that they're going to they might have the first 5 engineers where they're going to get their 6th. That's not something we would necessarily worry about here, because we know those people are available and coming out of school and coming out of the workforce, and there's a good pool of talent. So.
Yeah, I'll add one more quick thing to this, which is that it's expensive to run a company in the Bay Area. Really, really expensive. The board meetings I'm in the Bay Area, like when people bring up an example of a lease, right? Like the lease is material. It's going for almost $100 a square foot right now in the Bay Area. So, and people are asking for stock. Landlords are asking for stock as part of the lease agreement because there's no vacancy. Like office space is just insane. And I was at the Culture Amp board meeting, and they were bringing up the fact they were moving this fancy new office. I'm like, how much is it? And they tell me the price. I'm like, oh, that's like 1/10 of what it costs in the Bay Area. Don't even bring this up at the board meeting. Just go sign the damn lease. And it's the same with engineering talent, right? There's really amazing sort of, the Victoria State gives an amazing sort of rebate back to some of the R&D credits for Culture Amp, that it's almost half the cost of bringing an engineer or a product manager in Melbourne than it is in San Francisco. I was going through sort of the headcount and the budget recently at this past board meeting, and I'm just floored by how, I don't use the word inexpensive, but it's how frugal you can be in sort of running. And that's a massive competitive advantage that I think locating your talent here is compared to the Bay Area, and that's something that I think both Canva and Culture Amp have used to their advantage to be able to do a lot with a lot more with a lot less money.
Well, and Michael, you said that you would keep your if you had started today, you would stay here, and you would HQ here with Autopilot. Is that still true, or was that just backstage fodder?
No, I think it's true. I mean, it's sort of hard to say, right? Like, I've made so many great friendships. I've been able to meet with great companies over there, and I've had such a wonderful experience. So if I didn't know what I know now, then yeah, I would have I would have stayed in Sydney for sure, for a lot of the reasons Wesley mentioned in just the ecosystem's formed here now. I mean, 5 years ago, people wouldn't even accept job offers. They're like, what
Right.
You've raised like $1 million, like who cares? Like, it wasn't really, it was very hard to recruit people on sort of dreams, whereas now it's a lot easier to recruit people because they understand, like, there's an ecosystem, there's a brand around Blackbird, there's people like Wesley over here talking about startups, so it's much more sort of easy to recruit. So we actually have about 32 people in Sydney now, and it's growing quite rapidly. So we have an office in both San Francisco and Sydney, and then some people in Europe as well. So we definitely think distributed and globally, but we still manage most of our operation out of San Francisco.
And what would it take for you to manage most of your operation here in Sydney and move back? And how much does national pride kind of play into that, or at all if it doesn't?
A little bit. I mean, every Australian, right, just like Americans, you're kind of proud of where you're from, and you want to...
Not anymore.
Yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough. I'm actually not, yeah. Anyway. But, yeah, so it does play a big part. I think it's nice to also, like, have a base here still and be close to family when I come back and see friends and things like that at a personal level. But also it's nice to be able to reinvest and sort of take what we've learned from being in Silicon Valley for a number of years and bring it back and sort of instill that in our culture here and build like a Silicon Valley-esque sort of environment in our office in Sydney. And as a result, we've been able to attract some marvelous engineers. I mean, the talent here is just incredible, like I never imagined. And so, we're really excited about Australia again, and we're investing heavily here right now.
Chris, do you think that the SV funding scene is attractive to startups because of the money? Or does it have to do with, connections and proximity to this network of people who have been doing this for 20, 30 years?
Yeah, so Wesley, you mentioned a really interesting point about, finding senior talent and helping with senior executives and recruiting and so on. So there's definitely some network effects that are really beneficial in the Valley. So, if you've been there and been working and you've been in and out of different startups, you know people who maybe were founders and are now senior executives that can be hired. We at Data Collective VC have an equity partner network, so we have 60 or so people who are investors/partners. We call them equity partners, and so they're both LPs and able to assist with deals. And so when we meet in a situation that we're not sure of how to solve, we have this huge network of people we can reach out to, and they're there and available, and they give us a couple of hours a week. So we can solve a lot of problems firsthand. And I think one of the things that defines I think both of our firms is an ability to sort of roll up our sleeves and pitch in and help. That's very hard when the company is overseas. And so there's definitely a benefit to sort of being part of that network. And I don't know if you would agree, but
Well, and it's not a binary thing either, right? It's not like a question between Sydney and Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
There's obviously lots of opportunity across the globe. Wesley, with the globe,
This goes to sort of what Chris said. This is a core value of the both of our firms, right? And the reason why it made sense for us to be working with Canva and CultureAmp. They're located here. We have very, very deep connections in Silicon Valley and in the States, and so that's a very huge value add. And Didier, who's the CEO of CultureAmp, comes and visits the Bay Area a lot, and we sort of facilitate a lot of customer intros or executive intros. There's he recently went through sort of saying, I need to figure out how to bring in some, my head of marketing and my head of growth, and we sort of said, well, these are the best people in the Valley. You can't hire them because they're, very, very happily employed where they are, but we want you to meet them so you know what that excellence looks like. And that's part of the help that, we sort of bring in, Data Collective as well, and sort of saying, here are some of the best of breed guys that have been doing this for ages, and, make those introductions so that he can level set on what he needs to do when he wants to bring that talent here in Melbourne.
Yeah, well, and without being like too far out from left field, but like massive sums of money are being, not given, but invested in startups in China from both the government and from these massive firms. What kind of, is that an option when we're kind of laying out this field of Sydney versus Silicon Valley? Is that something to think about?
In government money? There's, there is government money that does go into startups here. Yeah, I mean, we work closely with Tencent, but the Australian government does actually invest quite a bit into research and development here. Again, we see these wonderful tax or R&D credits that both some of our Australian companies have taken advantage of, and it actually is meaningful, and it allows you to do so much more. With a lot less money raised. Our CultureAmp and Canva tend to be two of our most capital efficient companies that we've ever invested in. And, I can't believe the burn rates compared to some of the burn rates in Silicon Valley, where again the lease eats up a third of the money that you raise. So back to your question, is the government a helpful sort of vehicle here in Australia? Absolutely. Is there going to be a situation like in China where you have these massive funds with government money coming in from state banks? In Australia, probably not. And but you're seeing investments coming in from some Chinese entities, right? Like I think Sequoia China just did its first Australian investment, and that's that's something that we hadn't seen before, and so we're really happy that that's more sort of capital coming in. That said, you don't want to overstate that much or push too much capital into an ecosystem that might not be ready for it. So we're always watching and making sure there's a good sort of balance.
Michael, you're kind of obviously past the seed stage, but I'm curious what all three of you think, because there's a lot of talk right now about how Silicon Valley is kind of in this seed squeeze where seed checks are getting much bigger. There's time constraints on investors who go into these early stage investments with, regards to their existing portfolio. And the competition there, even though there's more money in seed than there ever has been, it's far more competitive, or at least feels more tight. Whereas here, we're before that time, right? We're still waiting for the kind of overflow of new founders and new, liquid capital and new investors, angel investors, early institutional seed investors. So, I mean, one, do we think that the Silicon Valley early stage heyday is over, or is it just kind of a slower period? And two, how far out do we think that Australian seed heyday is?
Yeah, I mean, I think, with the fact that seeds, I really just think they're the new Series A, right? And at the end of the day, it's just title inflation. If you need $3 million to get your company to the next step, you need $3 million. Is it a convertible note? Is it a price seed? Is it a Series A? I think that's just a label, and it doesn't really matter. And so what I spend a lot of time doing with companies is encouraging them to really go back and reassess how much money they actually need for the next inflection point, and just price that and raise that. And so when you have a solid plan and the numbers check out, then I think you can get the money, whether there's pressure or not. And I think that's true for Australia as well. And I don't know, I think the biggest factor that dominates that decision here in Australia is finding investors who have the expertise to understand what you're actually doing, and can they understand your business plan, and particularly if it's a high risk thing, like a lot of the deep tech investments we do. I think it is harder to find investors in Australia who can do the diligence and understand and agree with you that the amount of money you're raising is going to get you where you think it's going to get you. So I think that's the sort of a big difference between the two countries.
Additional thoughts, Wesley? No?
Oh, it's, it is harder early stage to raise money here than the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, our fund Felicis started out as one of 7 sort of institutional super angel or seed funds, almost 8 or 9 years ago. And today, our SVB, which is Silicon Valley Bank, is now tracking over 350 seed funds. So it just shows this plethora of seed capital where you can walk out the YC demo day and literally there's like a whole back row of football players sitting in back, like holding up term sheets, which I think is kind of crazy. And last one there were like 4 rappers in the front row, which also was kind of nuts. But that just shows you the competition in Silicon Valley and the ecosystem and where sort of people invest. And I don't see that here. So I think it is much easier to raise in the Bay Area. That said, there are great companies coming out of here, and I think that the fact that Atlassian came out of Australia, you have Canva, skyrocketing and coming out. CultureAmp's another great example where they're well known outside of Australia. Campaign Monitor was another great one. When you start seeing this examples of like really amazing companies coming out, and Autopilot, is another one that's taken note since you've moved to Palo Alto. So that example will sort of attract the capital to come here internationally, and I think that's you're seeing a little bit of that already happen.
And Michael, as someone who has raised money from both Australian investors and investors in the Bay Area, what advice do you have for entrepreneurs in the audience today who may be doing either? And are there differences in those approaches?
Yeah, I think obviously you've got limited options here. Like Wesley said, there's probably a higher bar to get investment in Australia, although I haven't been here for some time, so I'm not entirely sure. But I do think there is a higher bar, whereas in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, anywhere in the Bay Area, there are a number of people. Like you said, there's a lot of wealth there, and it's pretty, well, I don't want to say easy, but it's pretty straightforward to raise money if you've got a strong idea and a good founding team. My advice would be that I wouldn't necessarily worry about the money, and I think this is what sort of Chris was saying is like the bigger or more important issue is like, do you have an idea that's meaningful? Do you have customers? Do you have people that want this? How much money do you need to get to the next milestone? And then find people who have appropriate experience with your industry or segment. And I think that's the better focus. Whether that's in Australia or Silicon Valley is going to depend on the type of business that you have. I think like Canva and CultureAmp are good examples because they're like global. They can sell from anywhere in the world. People can buy online. They can try it. They can put a credit card in to buy. But the people today that we're talking about, like medical equipment and the Twitch for broadcasting sport, I mean, they're going to need rights holders for the like the NFL or something to be a huge company. So going to the Bay Area makes total sense. So I guess it just really depends, which is not a great answer.
Okay, cool. So just figure it out.
Yeah, just figure it out. You'll be fine.
Yeah, trial and error. Chris, I was curious. You obviously you have a huge interest in space tech,
right?
And you moved to the U.S. as part of that because you wanted to, have more opportunities in that realm. Like fast forward to today, do you think, one, that the private sector has kind of opened up opportunity? I know Elon Musk gave a keynote here.
Right.
Is that a burgeoning opportunity for the Australasia area?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think everything that was said previously it can be added up to answer this question. because there was, first of all, space was terribly expensive in the past, and there was no real available capital in Australia and not much of a workforce. So I left, went worked at NASA, and then ended up starting a company in the Bay Area. And then when I started coming back to Australia more regularly, I found that suddenly there were all of these CubeSat programs, small spacecraft programs in universities all around the country. And the cost had dropped to the floor, basically. And there was a burgeoning sort of, startup capital scene. And so now all of the things line up. And, it's very interesting that Australia has announced this space agency, because I think one form that could take is to be completely startup driven, where now entrepreneurs, what we couldn't do years ago, we wouldn't get a multi-billion-dollar budget for a space agency in Australia. Now we can do it with our own hands in our own garages, and I think that's really exciting. And that totally changed since I left. So I think, if I was a student now and I wanted to do a space company, I would probably give it a real shot in Australia.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. But thank you very much, you guys. I think this was a good panel. Did you guys enjoy it? Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.